Joe Biden has decided to not seek re-election as the President of the United States. By now, this is old news, but I figured that I'd give you my thoughts about it, just in case you're not sick of people waffling about this already, and just in case I had a unique perspective to add, hopefully. Now, Joe Biden, of course, had been under quite a lot of criticism in relation to his performance throughout his presidency, but more recently his performance in the most recent presidential debate. His performance was nothing short of a disaster. He meandered all over the place when answering questions, if he answered them at all. He appeared to be completely out of it. This is both in terms of appearance and in terms of how he answered the questions. It was a trash fire. Not long thereafter, there were calls for Joe Biden to step aside and to clear the way for a different person to seek the presidential election. And lo and behold, a few weeks on, he has done just that. And this came after Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama and various other Democrat luminaries decided to pool their support for him, either behind closed doors or in public, or to some extent a little bit of both when they'd spoken to him specifically and then that had leaked to the press, just trying to put more pressure onto him. Now, with Joe Biden stepping aside, Kamala Harris is the presumptive Democrat nominee. Joe Biden endorsed Kamala Harris to become the next president, or at least the next presidential candidate. Similarly with many other Democrats, such as Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren, in addition to AOC and the Squad. Some other people, such as Barack Obama, have suggested that maybe there should be a contested convention, whereby Kamala Harris has to win her election, rather than just having it handed directly to her. Now, of course, this could change over time. Maybe Barack Obama will decide to just outright endorse Kamala Harris. It remains to be seen. But at the moment, there's a lot of support behind her, and no clear alternative, with many other potential contenders deciding whether or not they will actually put the hat into the ring. After all, if you're the Democrat nominee this time, it might be a little bit of a poisoned chalice, because it does appear their chances of winning are not exactly high. Because not only will they come in as a new contender, but they'll come in having to perhaps fight on Joe Biden's record, which has not been particularly popular. That is going to be saddled with both his performance and also saddled with being a newcomer. Kamala Harris, to some extent, gets a little bit around being the unknown newcomer aspect of it because she served with Joe Biden. However, she is also saddled with Joe Biden's legacy and with her poor performance throughout his presidency, particularly given that she was in charge of overseeing border security and she didn't seem to do a particularly good job of this. Hence why the public might not particularly warm to her. Now, Kamala Harris, like I've indicated, is the presumptive nominee. This in large part is because she was the vice president and therefore would by default be the ordinary nominee to take over from him, but also because the Biden-Harris campaign, which has raised many millions of dollars, might have to return that to donors or otherwise distribute it and not use it directly for the campaign if Harris were to not become the nominee. That is, when people donated money to the Biden-Harris campaign, they donated to a ticket with Joe Biden and or Kamala Harris on the ticket. But if neither of them are on the ticket, then the money needs to go elsewhere and it can't just go directly to whoever the successor happens to be. So therefore she is the most likely to take over. Kamala Harris has indicated she intends to do so and intends to seek becoming the nominee for the Democrats. At the convention, of course, she might not ultimately get it, but there's no clear alternative at the moment. There's talks of perhaps Gretchen Whitmer perhaps contending, but that's not very obvious at the moment and she hasn't necessarily indicated she will do so. Joe Manchin has suggested that he might do so, but again, it's not clear-cut. Gavin Newsom appears to be endorsing Kamala Harris, which is rather smart, because Gavin Newsom seems to have no chance of actually winning, but also Gavin Newsom probably realizes that he might as well just wait to clear the air after he becomes governor of California, let people forget about how bad he was, and then maybe try to become president at that point in time, rather than seeking it right now. Now, of course, in terms of how this will affect the election, well, it's not entirely clear. Kamala Harris is not exactly popular. Neither is Donald Trump necessarily. He is both polarizing. However, Kamala Harris is not particularly well-liked. And she also doesn't particularly present very well, in that whenever she's speaking, she often sounds condescending and meanders, and doesn't seem to have a clear point when she is talking. She seems to just speak in generalities, aphorisms, and in a vague manner. And that doesn't seem like it will go over very well with the electorate that wants clear, cogent answers to their many problems, chief amongst which is cost of living and border security. And to be very clear, border security is a weakness for the Democrats. And since, like she's indicated, she was in charge of border security, this will come back to haunt her. Kamala Harris was also an attorney general, and that could come back to haunt her, because her record on things such as criminal justice is not necessarily that great. She's seen as overseeing some incredibly harsh sentences for what we'd now regard as relatively minor offences. Joe Biden, of course, was saddled with this as well, however, he appears to have overcome it. There's a little bit less distance, however, between Kamala Harris's actions and her presidency than there was for Joe Biden. Kamala Harris also has the distinct disadvantage of Donald Trump now being in his ascendancy. That is, Donald Trump has now come back very strong from his debate performance and come back incredibly strong after the assassination attempt, when the American public saw both how much fight and vigor is in him, but also the American public saw how polarized some of the rhetoric has become. And there's the concern that maybe the rhetoric has become so heated and so negative toward Donald Trump that people are now taking it in their own hands to try to remove him from the race, which is inherently anti-democratic. Now, at the moment, we don't necessarily know the motive for the person who attempted to assassinate Donald Trump, but it appears very clear that he either didn't like Donald Trump specifically, or he at least didn't like any politician specifically, and therefore he decided to set his sights on Donald Trump. That is, there's a prevailing thought that the heated rhetoric coming from many of the Democrats had precipitated this particular attempt. Now, to be clear, the heated rhetoric would fall rather short of rising to the level of being incitement. However, it absolutely looks incredibly bad, particularly since Joe Biden had mentioned the idea of putting a bullseye on Donald Trump just before the assassination attempt. The Democrats are going to have to wear their rhetoric, and this permeates throughout the whole of the Democrat Party, and it will infect Kamala Harris's presidency, even if she has been slightly less strident and aggressive in her personal rhetoric about Donald Trump. In short, Donald Trump is in his ascendancy. Now, of course, there's a debate about whether J.D. Vance, who is Donald Trump's vice presidential pick, was a good pick or a bad pick. There's been analysis either way on this. There's been analysis that J.D. Vance doesn't really carry that many more votes. He's very similar in some respects to Donald Trump, at least in terms of the types of people who will attract. He's seen as perhaps getting some more votes from some swing states and from the Rust Belt. But it's not entirely clear whether or not he was really needed to secure those votes, or whether Donald Trump would have gotten those anyway. One might argue that someone like Vivek Ramaswamy would have been a better selection, potentially gathering more votes for Donald Trump than J.D. Vance would. Nevertheless, Donald Trump has at least a coherent ticket that everyone in the Republican Party is behind. It's not clear at this point who Kamala Harris's vice presidential pick will be. There's talk that it might be a governor from a swing state, but again, that's just speculation. There haven't been any clear names actually floated or raised or specifically discussed, and Kamala Harris doesn't have long to make the public familiar with who her vice presidential pick is. And she doesn't really have very long to make the public familiar and comfortable with her as a president. And therefore, while the Democrats' chances of winning might have increased incrementally because at least Kamala Harris doesn't appear to be senile and non-functional, they certainly don't appear to have a slam dunk. One thing I do want to mention, however, is I'm not entirely sure this is about age per se, so much as competence. There are many relatively old people who are incredibly competent right up until the very end. An example that clearly leaps to mind is someone such as Charlie Munger, who was incredibly functional all the way up until the age of 99 when he passed away. So age is not the issue so much as competence, and I'm more concerned about Joe Biden's competence or lack thereof than I am about him being in his 80s. I don't think that Kamala Harris necessarily being younger is going to really help her very much, given how much verve Donald Trump showed in the wake of the assassination attempt, and given that he has always been similarly coherent to how he is now. But do let me know your thoughts about Joe Biden stepping aside, and whether you think this will help the Democrats or not, and whether or not you think it's going to make much of a difference. I'd be interested to hear what you think in the comments below.